the song. Thoughts become action, tell me what's happening. What's your mind wrapped around?
An option for button, so we can do an input type button, set a value for submit or something like that, and close that off. So that gives us a button to submit it. But it's actually not working because it's just the type is just a button, and it's not actually being specific that this is our submit button. So we need to be able to specify that what we want our button to do. We want to make it submit. So there's a number of different ways to accomplish this where we can set, instead of a button, what we want this to do is actually submit our form. So by default changes it to submit button. Even if I was to get rid of the value here, we see by default the browser knows that this is a submit button, so to give it submit. When I click the button, it tries to actually submit the content here. So here, let's update the email, and this is where it gets really interesting because I've specified this as email and I try to submit it, we get this message that says please include the @ in the email address. And this is new with HTML5 because this gives us the ability essentially to say what type of input we're expecting. So it checks and it sees before we submit it that making sure that the user is actually submitting email information in there. We also have additional fields, so I'm going to just do a default here, and we've got ones where we can specify the type, so we can do something like number, and I'm going to get rid of that. So we've got a number here, so if I try to type in text in here, it's not going to let me. Make sure that I always have a number in there. I can also update this, do color. So we get the color picker popping up. And these are all brand new with HTML5. We see we've got a whole bunch of really nice different types that we can really utilize. We also have ones that previously with HTML5, so we had ones, so I'm going to get rid of that, and we had radio buttons. So these are the radio buttons. And typically with radio buttons you'd have two, and one other thing with radio buttons is make sure that, so if you've got two radio buttons, make sure that the name is the same, and that gives us the ability to have this type of effect where we click on one, it can toggle between them. So always making sure that we have at least one radio button. If we're using radio buttons, make sure you have a couple of them, keep the name the same in order to be able to toggle between them. We have another type here where we can specify that if we need a checkbox. This is another type here. So similar to the radio buttons, we can change this into a checkbox if we wanted to. So we've got a number of different ones. Some of them a really nice one here with HTML5, we've got date. So we've got this default calendar that pops up, and we can specify the date, and that automatically populates it. We saw that we could do email, text, number. We've got a URL, so this is another useful one because if I try to type something in here, so that's not a URL, and if I submit it, we get that same error message that we got with the email. So making sure that our text that we're expecting is actually what the user is putting in. So a number of other ones that you might see, so we might see text, so there's text area. And this one is going to be different than their typical one, so we've got text area here, and the content is actually sitting in between here. Doing everything just with attributes, we've got content in here that we've got in the middle, and we see that output is being output there. And then here is where we could specify the name, so we have our text area or whatever we want to call it, and we see that the output sits in the middle. So this is another type of input where we can specify we have a whole bunch of content we want to pull in and so on. So along with a whole range of these different tags that we can use in these attributes, we also have the ability to add some more specific attributes within our HTML forms. So I'm going to show you more on this in the upcoming lesson. The previous lesson we saw all the really cool things we can do with HTML forms. So in this lesson I want to get more specific on the different attributes that are available to us when we're creating our forms. So with forms there's quite a lot that you can do with them. And one of the things that you can do is you can set some default values. So if we want to set a value of, for the first name, so everyone coming in would automatically see this first name of Mike, we can go value equals Mike. So same thing that we did over here with the input button. So if we don't want to type submit, then we can do value, hit this, or whatever we want to call it, and we see that that changes. So the value attribute is used in order to change the value of the input form. We can also do things where maybe we want to disable this, so we can do disabled, and that gives us the ability to not give them an opportunity to actually update the content in there. We can also specify things where we want to specify required as well. So this email, maybe we want to do required. So this is HTML5. So when I click it, we've got this pop-up here that says please fill in this form. This is another really useful one in HTML5 where we're setting that required. So another thing here in order to keep in mind is what we actually do with the form itself. So we don't actually know, we haven't specified where we're actually sending this form or how we're sending this form or anything like that. And this is where you need to add in some attributes within the form itself. So the action is going to specify where we're actually sending the form to, submit dot, and usually you're going to do something where you're submitting it to the server end so it can actually pick up that data and utilize it. So if we do submit and now we click it, and I should actually take this required off because otherwise I'm going to constantly have to click that. So if I click this, let's just save this quickly, we click it, and we see that we don't have that URL, so we got to go back there. And that's one of the things here within the form, that when we specify where we're going, it actually defaults and sends that page to there. There's another thing that's really important within forms, and that's to specify the method. So with forms, we have an option to send get method, and actually within here we're not able to see, so I'm going to create a brand new page, place this form in here, and we'll just save it as myform.html, and now I can go over to here and let's go over to myform.html. So now we see we've got this form here, and I click it and we see, so it's trying to send it over to submit.com, but look in the URI here where we've actually specified the information that we entered into the form, and this is what I meant by what we're receiving within the form. And when we use get, it actually places this content from the form into our URL here within where we're sending the data. If we use post, what's going to happen, so now when I refresh this, and now remember this isn't get anymore, this now is post, so when I click it, we see that we don't get any of that information being passed within the URI. And basically the difference between the get and the post is where you send your secure information. So if you've got passwords or you've got a bunch of data that you want to keep from being within the URL, then make sure that you are submitting via post instead of get, because get is not secure, and it's not the best way to send data. Because it is readable within the URI, and if you're picking up from the URI, if somebody gets that URI, then that actually can get sent over and submitted to the server, so if the server is picking up that information. So use post for secure communications, use get for if you want that data to be sitting within the URL. And if you don't specify the page that you're sending it to, so I'm going back out here, I'm going to refresh it, and I hit it, so we just default back to the default page. Or I should say the current page that the user's on. So we don't actually go to a new page, we just go back to the same page that we just sent from. And so the important part of this lesson is this is why we specify the names, because this is how we pick it up within the server. If we didn't specify these names, we'd actually have no way to be able to pick up the content here. So see within that URL there where you can type in some content there, and of course it needs to be a URL. So let's create a URL here. And when we hit it, we're not actually passing anything over, and that's because we haven't specified the name. But if I change this and if I add a name to there, so I'm going to just call it URL, go back out, refresh this page, now I got to type in a URL again, and now too many T's. So now we see that now it's actually passed within the URL here up at the top. So always make sure that you do specify the name, and this is how you're able to retrieve that data on the other end when you're picking that up. So that's how you work with forms in HTML. So in the next lesson, we're going to finalize the course. We're going to quickly go over how we can add in styling, how we can add in JavaScript, and how we can really update our web page in order to make it more effective and dynamic using CSS, making it look better, and then JavaScript in order to add dynamic interactions. So that's coming up in the next lesson. In this lesson, I want to show you more about how we can work with CSS, how we can add CSS to our web pages, and a whole lot more. So previously we looked at what we can do with forms, and we saw we can do quite a lot of really neat things with forms. So I'm going to just go back and open up our original index page here. So this is that original web page that we were working with. And we're going to take a closer look at what we were working with styling. So going over to CodePen, which we also had looked at within the course, we saw that CodePen breaks apart our code into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we also saw that if I wanted to, I could connect the form. I could do something like background color, and I could specify a color here and see that it automatically takes effect. So what is happening here? And also, if I want to include some JavaScript, I can do some quick JavaScript there. We see that we get this pop-up window coming, and as it page renders out, we get our JavaScript firing off, we get our CSS. And the way that this is working, with CSS, we saw that we can include it within the same page, but we also saw way back within, when we were looking at the original source code, we see we've got a lot of links out to CSS pages. And we can do it, and this is actually the smarter way to bring CSS into your web projects, because this gives you the ability to actually build out a website and link a whole bunch of pages, and then when you update that CSS file, then it updates all of your web pages simultaneously, because all they are is they're connecting and they're getting their CSS or their styling values from that CSS page. So let's show you how that works. So going back into our source code, let's remove out our on-page styling, save that, open up a new file, paste that in, and notice that I'm not adding any HTML files. I'm not opening and closing, or HTML tags opening and closing, because this is going to be a different type of file. It's a CSS file. So let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to call it style CSS, give an extension of CSS, and now this is an actual CSS file. So let's show that sidebar, and now whenever we save our index page, we go back out here, and let's go back out to that index page, refresh it. So all of our styling is gone. We've lost our styling on our page, and that means that we need to hook up and connect to that CSS page. And again, the real nice part about linking out to CSS pages and why it's being done on numbers of web pages is that now if I've got index, if I've got my forum, all of them are linking out to that CSS file. If I update the CSS file, it updates all of those pages, the output of the pages. So you can by all means also include styling, so on-page styling. So if you had specific styling for this specific page, you could add that in. Just as if you had styling for each individual element, you could add it in as an attribute as well. And this is where the order of where you're representing that content comes into play, because if we want to adjust stuff on our web page after the styling is brought in, we put the style after we link out to the style sheet. If we want to do it before, then, which typically isn't done, then we would do it before. So let's set this CSS